welcome to another edition of After Hours. On Sunday, we finished up our series in Psalms, the Poems, Prayers, and Promises series. And since really the whole teaching was kind of in applying the word, I'm going to do something different this week in After Hours. I want to look forward to our next series. Starting next Sunday, we're going to be beginning a series in the Gospel of Mark. It's going to be a long study. It'll probably take 1.5 to 2 years to actually get through everything. We'll have some breaks in there. But, to cover a gospel is going to take quite a period of time. We're calling this series Jesus, the King Who Came to Die. We did a lot of, kind of looking around and thinking and talking back and forth to capture some of the key themes for that gospel. And I'll be giving kind of an introductory teaching this Sunday from just Mark 1:1. But I wanted to take today to give some background information on the Gospel of Mark. I'm not going to take time to do that on Sunday morning, but I want to give a little bit of background information just to help situate us as we get ready to study Mark's Gospel. So the first question when you do a study on something like this is, well, who wrote Mark? Interestingly enough, it doesn't say anywhere in the Gospel. We have at the beginning of the book, it says, the Gospel according to Mark, and that's because in ancient Greek manuscripts, they often had katamarkon, which is according to Mark, from the very earliest times, but it's not actually in the book itself. That was a title that was affixed later on. However, early tradition in the church, and we have a good amount of it, unanimously says this gospel, the one that we have second of the four gospels, was written by Mark. And Mark is known from the pages of the New Testament. Sometimes he's referred to as John Mark. If you look in Acts chapter 12, verse 12, it refers to him as Mark, known also as John, or some translations will say John Mark. He traveled with Paul and Barnabas on their first missionary journey. You can read about that in Acts chapter 12 as he goes on. But then he left them partway through. We're not told exactly what happened, but Mark left. There was a lot of persecution happening, but he was Barnabas's cousin. And so when it came time in Acts 15, when Paul and Barnabas were going to go back around to visit the churches and to do some work, Barnabas wanted to take Mark along with them, but Paul did not. You can read about this in Acts chapter 15 as well. It caused such a division, they split up. However, we know that later on, Mark is back with Paul. You can see in Colossians chapter 4, verse 10, Philemon, verse 24, and 2 Timothy 4:11. In Colossians 4 and in Philemon, Mark is actually with Paul, laboring with him. And then in 2 Timothy 4:11, some of the last words the Apostle Paul ever wrote, he tells Timothy, I want you to come see me, and I want you to get Mark and bring him, for he is helpful to me with my ministry. But what's interesting is, not only is Mark there with Paul and so helpful to Paul that Paul wants to see him at the end of his life, Mark is also a known associate of Peter. So in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13, Peter refers to Mark as my son Mark, and he's there at Rome. And so this is important for two reasons, which are the next 2 points that I want to make. And that is that when we talk about Mark writing the gospel, that early tradition also tells us that Mark wrote the gospel based on information he got from Peter. One of the earliest fragments that reports this, and probably the most important one, is by a man named Papias, who was the bishop of a place called Hierapolis until around 130 AD. So this is very early in the history of the church. He died in 130 AD, which means he knew apostles. And we don't have the original writing of Papias. It was known in the early church, but like many other things, it gets lost. But Eusebius, the kind of first great church historian, or I should say second after Luke in the New Testament, Eusebius writes and records what Papias said, and said that Papias noted that he got this from the elder or the presbyter, which is probably referring to the Apostle John. Many scholars agree, as John wrote 2nd and 3rd John, he used that phrase, the elder or the presbyter, to refer to himself. And so people think that this was a tradition that Papias received from the Apostle John late in the 1st century, and he was still reporting it early in the 2nd century. And here's what he said. He said, Mark became Peter's interpreter and wrote accurately all that he remembered, not indeed in order of the things said and done by the Lord. And so we learn a few things here. Mark got his information from Peter. He actually uses the word, he's the interpreter of Peter. That Mark was probably not an eyewitness for at least most of Jesus's ministry. He did not try to convey everything in chronological order. He probably was getting a lot of this as Peter was just preaching various times and places. And so Mark, we're going to see, doesn't necessarily follow strict chronology. Rather, he pieces things together according to the topic and kind of puts them in clumps of events that are happening. But he's very careful, John told Papias, to give an accurate, careful accounting of actually what Jesus said and did. So it's a truthful record. Mark just wasn't trying to put it in chronological order, which down to this day is a struggle that historians always face. Do you do things chronologically or topically? Very often with the big, huge biographies we're getting written today, they do a little bit of both. But in his day, Mark had to make a choice, and he more or less followed a more topical arrangement rather than strict chronology. And we learn all of that from Papias. So we know that Mark is writing based on information from Peter. So in many ways, this is almost, we could refer to it as Peter's gospel. Peter is the source of much of this information. Now that leads to another question, which is, what is the date and location of Mark's writing? Now, because Peter wrote 1 Peter from Rome, and he says that Mark is there in Rome with him, and we have other early church traditions saying that Mark got his information from Peter and was with Peter, the most common place that it's assumed that Mark wrote his gospel from was the church at Rome. There's nothing in the gospel that says this directly, but there's really, on the other hand, no reason to doubt it. The gospel was received very early. Many of the writings were associated with kind of large, important churches. Rome was certainly that. We know Peter was there near the end of his life. We know that Mark was there with him. So it probably, Rome's as good a guess as any. Fortunately, it doesn't really affect the understanding of the gospel very greatly. What we do know from reading the gospel itself is Mark is writing not only with Jews, but also with Gentiles in mind. And the reason we know this is Mark takes time sometimes to describe Jewish phrases and customs that a Jew would not need described or interpreted, but a Gentile far away, perhaps in a place like Rome, may well need to understand what was going on in Palestine at the time of Jesus. So Mark is clearly writing with Gentiles in mind. Now, as to the question of date, the most likely date is before 60 AD, the year 60, so it'd be some less than 30 years or so after Jesus died. Now, there are some liberal scholars want to date everything very late, but there's really no reason to believe this. We have very strong tradition that Mark was with Peter, and Peter appears to have gone to Rome, from everything we can tell, in the mid-50s. And Peter was martyred under Nero. We have firm traditional accounts of this, and that means Nero himself committed suicide in 68 AD. So Peter had to have died before 68. So Mark had gotten all of his information prior to 68, but Peter could have been martyred. The persecution under Nero ran from 64 to 68. So anywhere in that period, Peter could have died. And another point that's really important, because of course Mark could have written the gospel after Peter died, and there is some early church tradition that it seems like it indicates it may have been after the death of Peter, but we do have to take into account that Matthew and Luke both seem to have followed Mark. They both consulted Mark in writing their gospel. That's because both Matthew and Luke include a lot of information that seems to be drawn from Mark. In fact, sometimes they're quoting him almost verbatim. And because Matthew and Luke are both doing this, the easiest way to understand this is that the original source is Mark. It's almost never that Mark and Matthew are quoting Luke, or Mark and Luke are quoting Matthew. It's almost always Matthew and Luke seem to be writing based on Mark, that they seem to be quoting Mark. Now, why this is important is because we know Luke wrote two works in the New Testament, Luke and Acts. He wrote Luke first, which is based upon the Gospel of Mark, and then he wrote Acts. But Acts ends with Paul in prison in Rome around 62 AD. before even the persecution under Nero is broken out. Most scholars agree and think that Paul was in fact let go before the persecution under Nero broke out and then was later brought back to Rome. All of which means it's almost certain that the book of Acts was written prior to 62 AD. If Acts was written prior to 62 AD, Luke had to have been written prior to probably 60 AD, and Luke was consulting from Mark's gospel, at least some form of Mark's gospel. It may have been a little bit earlier form, but what that means is Mark in its essence was probably recorded before 60 AD, which means this is very early history. It's not much further than if we think about us and 9/11. When we're starting this series, it'll be 9/11/2022, which will be 21 years from 9/11. Mark is not writing much further than that in time and distance, which means there's still a lot of living eyewitnesses around. There's a lot of people who saw and did these things, and it lends credence to the veracity of what Mark is saying. It's yet another historical marker that we can trust what Mark is saying. And the only real argument that is brought forward against this is that, again, some early traditions make it sound as if Peter was dead, but there undoubtedly were earlier versions, and the evidence is not completely clear. It's not in all things that it says that. It's really mainly in the one writing from Papias. So I tend to believe that Mark was probably written in the late 50s, and in fact is one of the earliest writings in our New Testament and is the earliest of the Gospels. So I'm going to go over other information about kind of the key themes of Mark coming up this Sunday on September the 11th as we look at Mark chapter 1, verse 1. But I wanted to encourage us to give a little bit of this background information, and I want to encourage you to go ahead and take time to start getting ready for us to walk through Mark's Gospel. We spent a summer in the Psalms. We're going to spend a long time in Mark's Gospel. And so what I'd like to encourage you to do is take the time sometime in the coming weeks to try and read the whole Gospel of Mark in one sitting. Now that may sound like a lot, but that's originally the way Mark was written. It was written as one letter. And I can tell you, because I did it a lot this summer, you can read Mark's Gospel. You can listen to an audio version of it on normal speed in about 80 minutes. You could go out for a long walk one day and you could listen to the entire Gospel of Mark. Or you could sit down with a cup of coffee or something and enjoy reading the Gospel. It'll take you about 80 minutes to do. But I encourage you to do that so you can start letting the story of Jesus, the King who came to die, settle in deep inside your soul. I'm looking forward to as we get to do this together, and we're going to unpack it passage by passage as we move along. But it'd be really helpful to get the big picture as Mark is giving his account of the gospel, who Jesus is and what he's done. I'm really looking forward to us taking this journey together and us taking a journey and walking with the disciples as they're grappling with who is this King who came to die and how do we respond to him? What does it mean to be a disciple? It's going to be an exciting series, and I look forward to us beginning this Sunday. Have a great week. God bless.